At 0200 hours on November 13, 1943, Marine Corporal Thomas Miller crouched in a waterlogged foxhole on the island of Bougainville, watching a Japanese bomber circle overhead like a vulture that refused to land. The sky was pitch black, a heavy velvet curtain hiding everything but the stars. Miller couldn't see the enemy aircraft, but he could feel it. The engines of the Japanese Betty bomber were slightly out of sync, producing a distinctive, rhythmic pulse that ground into the nerves of every man on the island. It was Washing Machine Charlie, the nightly visitor that kept 10,000 Americans awake, terrified and helpless. Miller gripped his rifle until his knuckles turned white, watching searchlight beams sweep across the clouds like desperate fingers clawing at smoke. Suddenly, one beam caught a flash of silver. For a split second, the Japanese bomber was illuminated, a tiny moth trapped in a flashlight's glare. The anti-aircraft guns roared to life. Tracers streaked upward, red lines of fire stitching through the darkness. But the Japanese pilot simply dipped a wing and slipped back into the shadows as easily as a man stepping out of a lit room. The firing stopped. The engine's drone continued. Then came the bomb. A 500-pound weapon fell from the invisible aircraft, accelerating as gravity seized it. It slammed into the fuel dump 300 yards away. The ground leapt. A massive fireball rolled into the night, turning darkness into a blinding orange noon. Miller cursed into the mud. It was the same story every night. The Japanese owned the darkness. For American forces in the Pacific, night was not a time for rest. It was a time to die. During the day, the sky belonged to the United States. Vought F-4U Corsair, Grumman F-6F Hellcat, and Lockheed P-38 Lightning ruled beneath the sun. They were faster, tougher, and flown by aggressive pilots who hunted the enemy relentlessly. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, the war flipped. American fighters were blind. They relied on the Mark I eyeball, human vision. And human vision is useless when you're flying 300 miles per hour inside a cloud at midnight. The Japanese understood this. They changed tactics. They stopped seeking fair fights in daylight and began sending solitary bombers to harass American airfields at night. They knew the Americans couldn't stop them. The Army Air Forces tried. They sent P-38 Lightnings up to patrol the darkness. It was practically a suicide mission. Pilots took off into an ink-black void, straining their eyes until they saw spots. They crashed into unseen mountains. They flew into the ocean after losing the horizon. And even when they survived, they couldn't find the enemy. It was like trying to swat a fly in a dark closet with a rolled-up newspaper. You might get lucky once in a million swings, but mostly you just broke the furniture. Morale on the ground began to crack. There is nothing worse for a soldier than feeling helpless. Men watched friends die in their sleep, torn apart by bombs dropped by an enemy they couldn't see. They needed a weapon that didn't guess where the enemy was. They needed a weapon that could see in the dark. In early 1944, a rumor began spreading through South Pacific airfields. The crates arrived first, massive wooden boxes that filled half the cargo holds of transport ships. Ground crews pried them open with crowbars, expecting spare engines or perhaps a shipment of jeeps. Instead, they found parts of an airplane that looked like it had been designed by a mad scientist who had never seen a runway. When the pieces were finally bolted together on the tarmac, the squadron's pilots gathered around to stare. They did not gasp in awe. They scoffed. It was the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. The factory called it the Black Widow. The pilots called it a bus. It was enormous. Not a sleek, single-seat fighter like a Mustang, but the size of a medium bomber. It had a 66-foot wingspan, wider than the North American B-25 Mitchell that bombed Tokyo. It sat on tricycle landing gear sturdy enough to support a bridge. Twin tail booms stretched back like the prongs of a giant fork. Fully loaded, it weighed more than 30,000 pounds. For comparison, a Wildcat fighter weighed about 7,000. The P-61 was 4 Wildcats welded together. It required a crew of 3. A pilot, a gunner, and a mysterious third man known as the radar observer, who sat in a dark compartment in the rear. The entire aircraft was painted glossy black, its skin shining wet even when dry. The hotshot fighter aces, Men who lived for speed and turning dogfights circled the machine, shaking their heads. They kicked the tires. They studied the massive greenhouse canopy and laughed. They asked if it came with a stewardess. They asked if it had a dining car. They called it a flying bathtub. They said it would turn like a dump truck. They claimed that if you took this lumbering beast into a dogfight with a Japanese Zero, you wouldn't just lose, you'd be embarrassed before you died. The criticism wasn't only about size. It was about philosophy. Fighter pilots were lone wolves. They trusted their eyes and their instincts. The P-61 demanded something different. Trust in a box of vacuum tubes. The nose of the aircraft wasn't packed with guns or engines. It housed the SCR-720 radar, a fiberglass cone containing a spinning dish antenna. Engineers claimed it could send out invisible waves, bounce them off an enemy plane miles away, and display the result as a glowing blip on a tiny green screen. To old-school pilots, it sounded like science fiction. Electronics failed. Radios broke. Engines quit. Now the Army wanted them to fly blind, ignore their instincts, and obey a voice from the back seat. Felt insane. They looked at P-61 crews with pity and contempt. They called them night witches. They placed bets on how long it would take before a Black Widow ended up as a smoking heap at the end of the runway. But Major Carroll Smith didn't care about the jokes. He was one of the first true believers. He walked around his P-61, nicknamed Time's a Wastin', and ran his hand over the cold black aluminum. He understood something the aces didn't. The war had changed. Speed meant nothing if you couldn't find the target. Agility meant nothing if you were blind. He examined the armament. Critics mocked the aircraft's weight but ignored the reason for it. The belly of the P-61 carried 4 20mm cannons, true artillery pieces. A single 20mm hit could tear the wing off a bomber. Mounted above the fuselage sat a powered turret with 4.50 caliber machine guns. The pilot could lock the turret forward, unleashing 8 guns at once. Or the gunner could rotate it to defend against attackers from behind. It was a flying battleship. Smith climbed the long ladder into the cockpit and settled into his high seat, positioned like the driver of a truck. The instrument panel glowed with dials, switches, and red lights. He put on his headset and clicked the intercom, checking in with the radar observer in the back. They were a team, 1 brain, 2 bodies. Outside, the sun was setting. Corsairs and Mustangs taxied in to sleep. The day shift was over. The real pilots were heading to the officers' club for beer and stories. For Smith and the Black Widow crews, the workday was just beginning. He stared into the darkening sky. He knew the Japanese bombers were out there. He knew Washing Machine Charlie was warming up his engines. Ground crews pulled the chocks from the massive wheels, their skepticism obvious. They doubted the monster would return. Smith started the engines. Twin Pratt and Whitney double Wasps roared to life, 2,000 horsepower each. Blue flames flickered from the exhaust stacks in the twilight. The aircraft trembled with deep, heavy vibration. Not the high-pitched whine of a fighter, but the low, angry growl of a predator. He released the brakes. The invisible giant began to roll. 30,000 pounds of doubt taxied toward the runway. Inside the P-61, the sky felt different than it did outside. Outside was a void of wind and darkness. Mountains waiting to kill you. An ocean like a black grave. Inside was a glowing cave of red instrument light and intercom chatter. But the heart of the machine was not the control stick or throttle. It was the dark compartment in the rear. There sat the radar observer, the mechanical eye of the aircraft. The SCR-720 radar spun in the fiberglass nose, sweeping hundreds of times per minute. It worked like a blind man tapping a cane, but instead of sound, it sent out pulses of radio energy. These pulses traveled at the speed of light, punching through clouds, rain, and fog. When they struck metal like the skin of a Japanese bomber, they bounced back. The antenna caught the echo. A computer the size of a refrigerator translated it into a glowing dot on a small green screen. To the untrained eye, the display looked like static. To a skilled radar observer, it was a map of the invisible world. He could see coastlines, mountains, and most importantly, the enemy. But detecting the blip was only half the battle. The harder part was convincing the pilot to trust it. Fighter pilots were used to controlling their own fate. Now they flew at 300 miles per hour through pitch-black clouds, unable to see even their own wingtips, while a voice in their headset told them to turn left, climb 500 feet, or reduce speed. It demanded trust that defied instinct. It was like driving a race car blindfolded while someone else shouted directions. Training was brutal. Crews learned an entirely new language. They practiced ground-controlled intercepts, where radar operators on the ground guided them close to the target before the aircraft's own radar took over for the final stalk. The era of the lone wolf was ending. The age of the hunter in the dark had begun. They flew practice missions against American bombers, creeping up behind them in the darkness until they were close enough to see the flicker of exhaust flames. They learned quickly that the radar had blind spots directly above and below the aircraft, which meant they had to approach their targets from roughly the same altitude. They discovered that rain clouds created false echoes, ghostly returns on the screen that looked exactly like enemy planes. They had to train themselves to tell the difference between a thunderstorm and a Betty bomber just by studying the fuzziness of a green dot. But the biggest problem wasn't the radar. It was the paint. When the Northrop P-61 Black Widow first arrived, the Army had painted it matte black. The reasoning seemed logical. If you want to hide in the dark, paint yourself the color of the dark. They used a rough, flat finish design to swallow light. In practice, it was a disaster. When a Japanese searchlight struck the matte surface, the rough texture grabbed the beam and scattered it. The aircraft didn't disappear, it glowed. It looked like a pale moth trapped in a flashlight beam. Instead of vanishing, the supposedly invisible plane stood out against the sky. The crews didn't wait for a solution from the factory. They improvised. Instead of absorbing light, they realized the aircraft needed to deflect it. The surface had to act like a mirror, not a sponge. If the paint were perfectly smooth and glossy, a searchlight beam would bounce away at an angle and disappear into the darkness. It was counterintuitive. You don't wear shiny clothes to hide. But physics doesn't care about intuition. Ground crews went to work. They scrubbed the airframes clean. They waxed them. They polished the black paint until it gleamed like wet glass. The rough, flat beasts became glossy black phantoms. When they tested the results, everyone was stunned. The P-61 could fly directly through a searchlight beam, and unless the light struck it at a perfect 90-degree angle, the aircraft remained nearly invisible. The beam simply slid off its skin. The flying bathtub had become a stealth fighter. Now equipped with a mechanical eye and an invisible cloak, Major Carroll Smith and his radar observer, Lieutenant Philip Porter, took Times A Waston on its first real hunt. The mission Night Combat Air Patrol over the American airfields on Saipan. For weeks, Japanese bombers had harassed the troops, coming in low and slow, dropping their bombs, then vanishing before day fighters could respond. The Marines below were exhausted, digging deeper into their foxholes every night and praying for dawn. Smith climbed into the night sky and leveled off at 10,000 feet. He dimmed the cockpit lights to a faint glow, preserving his night vision. Behind him, under a blackout curtain, Porter pressed his face into the rubber hood of the radar scope. Green sweep lines rotated endlessly, painting a picture of an empty sky. For an hour, there was nothing, just the steady drone of engines and static in the headset. It felt less like flying a fighter and more like driving a delivery truck down a deserted highway. Then the radio crackled to life. Ground control to Black Widow. Bogey detected. Vector 270. Angels 8. Distance 15 miles. Adrenaline surged through Smith like a jolt of electricity. He banked the heavy aircraft west. Contact, Porter said calmly from the back. Target 12 miles out, low and left. Smith saw nothing. The windshield was a black wall. He was flying entirely on instruments. I'm blind up here, Phil. Talk me in. Turn left 10 degrees, Porter instructed. Target speed 200 knots. Likely a Betty. Smith made the correction and advanced the throttles. The twin engines roared. This was the moment critics had mocked. They claimed the aircraft was too heavy. But 4,000 horsepower makes its own argument. The Black Widow devoured the distance. 10 miles, 8.5, Porter reported. We're closing. He doesn't see us. This was the most dangerous phase of the intercept. They were closing at over 100 miles per hour. Mistime it and they wouldn't shoot the bomber, they'd ram it. A midair collision in total darkness would kill everyone instantly. Smith eased back on the throttles. He lowered the flaps slightly. He crept forward like a cat stalking a mouse. 2 miles, Porter said. 1 mile. Look for exhaust. Smith strained his eyes. He searched for the faint blue flicker of engine flames, for a silhouette blotting out the stars. Nothing. A bead of sweat slid down his neck. His hands tightened on the yoke. He was trusting his life to a green dot he couldn't even see. 1/2 mile, Porter said quietly. Slow down. You're coming in hot. Then Smith saw it. At first, it wasn't a shape, just a patch of sky where the stars were missing. A moving black hole against the universe. As he closed, the void resolved into form. Thick wings, a cigar-shaped fuselage, twin engines. A Mitsubishi G4M. It cruised confidently, loaded with bombs intended for the Marines below. The Japanese crew had no idea that a 30,000-pound Predator was directly behind them. Smith flipped the master arm switch. He selected the 4 20mm cannons in the belly. The top turret could wait. The cannons were his sledgehammer. 500 yards, 400. He could see the bomber's gun positions. He could see the pilot's head moving in the cockpit. I have visual. Tally-ho. Clear to fire, Porter confirmed. Smith placed the illuminated pipper on the bomber's left wing root, right where the fuel tank sat. He squeezed the trigger. For 20mm cannons firing simultaneously was a physical experience. The aircraft shuddered violently. The roar drowned out the engines. Streams of high-explosive incendiary shells tore through the night. They didn't sparkle. They butchered. The shells slammed into the Betty's left wing. A blinding flash erupted, and the wing simply separated from the fuselage, shearing off and tumbling away. Fuel ignited. A massive fireball blossomed, lighting the ocean below like daylight. The bomber spun violently, trailing a comet tail of burning gasoline. Smith hauled back on the yoke, pulling the Black Widow up and away from the debris. He watched the fireball plunge into the sea. Splash one, Smith said, his voice shaking. Good kill, Porter replied. Scope is clear. Let's find another. They landed an hour later. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, smelling cordite lingering around the gun barrels. Smith climbed down the ladder, his legs unsteady. He had killed 5 or 6 men, and they had never even known he was there. It hadn't been a dogfight. It had been an execution. Word spread quickly. The flying bathtub worked. It was no longer a joke. The other pilots began looking at the Black Widow with something new in their eyes, respect. It was ugly. It was heavy. It was strange. But it was deadly. The Marines slept a little easier that night, knowing the giant was awake. But the Japanese were not fools. They noticed their bombers weren't returning. They saw wreckage washing ashore. They realized the Americans had found a way to see in the dark. And the Empire was not about to surrender the night without a fight. They had their own aces. They had their own fast aircraft. And soon they sent something new. Not bombers. Hunters. A week later, Smith and Porter were airborne again. The radar scope glowed green, but this time the blip wasn't slow and steady. It was fast. And maneuvering. Contact, Porter said, tension creeping into his voice. Target high speed. Intercept course. Smith tightened his grip. The hunter was becoming the hunted. The radar return wasn't just a dot anymore. It was a predator. Likely a Nakajima J-1N, designed to stalk American aircraft in darkness. It was lighter and faster in a straight line than the Black Widow. If this turned into a classic turning fight, physics said the 30,000-pound American machine should lose. The P-61 was enormous. Trying to outturn a dedicated fighter should have been like drifting a school bus. Smith pushed the throttles past the detent into war emergency power. The Pratt & Whitney engines surged as the water injection system activated, cooling the cylinders and boosting manifold pressure. Horsepower jumped from 2,000 to 2,200 per engine. Blue flames licked back over the wings, but the Japanese pilot pushed harder. The gap on the radar screen didn't shrink. The enemy had the positional advantage, high and behind, diving toward the Black Widow's 6 o'clock. He could see the dark silhouette below and didn't need radar. He lined up his 20mm cannons. He expected a sluggish target. He was wrong. The P-61 hid a secret in its wings. Instead of conventional ailerons, it used spoilers, metal plates that popped up from the top of the wing, instantly destroying lift on one side. It was a violent way to fly. When Smith slammed the stick left, the aircraft didn't wallow. It snapped. The left spoiler punched into the airstream. Lift vanished. The massive aircraft rolled with shocking speed. Smith pulled back hard on the yoke, dragging the nose into a brutal turn that crushed the crew into their seats. G-forces hammered them. The airframe shuddered under the strain, but it held. The Japanese pilot fired at empty air. The Black Widow had stepped aside like a matador, letting the bull rush past. For a brief moment, the positions reversed. But the Japanese pilot was skilled. He pulled into a vertical climb, trading speed for altitude, preparing to drop back down onto Smith's tail. Smith couldn't follow him upward. The P-61 was too heavy to win a climbing duel. But he didn't need to point the nose at the enemy to kill him. He had something the Japanese didn't. "Gunner, take the turret," Smith shouted. In the rear compartment, the gunner unlocked the General Electric turret mounted atop the fuselage. Normally locked forward, it now rotated with mechanical precision to face the rear. 4.50 caliber machine guns tracked the sky. The Japanese pilot came over the top of his loop, diving down confidently. He believed he had the American aircraft dead to rights. He had no idea the American had just grown teeth in its tail. He saw the twin tail booms. He saw the cockpit glass. He began to squeeze his trigger again. He never saw the 4 black barrels pivot toward him. The gunner pressed the firing studs. The turret erupted. Inside the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, the sound was deafening. A brutal, concussive pounding that seemed to hammer directly into the skull. For streams of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore backward into the face of the diving Japanese fighter. It was a wall of light, dense, violent, inescapable. The Japanese pilot flew straight into the storm. Heavy bullets smashed through his canopy. They shredded engine cowlings. They twisted propeller blades into scrap metal. The Nakajima J-1N didn't merely catch fire, it stopped flying. The sheer kinetic force ripped pieces from the airframe and hurled them into the darkness. The enemy aircraft tumbled past the Black Widow, a burning wreck spinning toward the ocean. Seconds later, it struck the water in a brief, violent explosion swallowed by the night. "Splash 2, the gunner said, breathless. Smith leveled the aircraft. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. He checked the gauges, everything still in the green. The beast was thirsty, devouring fuel at nearly 200 gallons per hour, but it was alive. They were alone in the dark once more. The radar screen showed nothing, but the night wasn't finished. Vector 180, ground control transmitted. Convoy of barges moving supplies near the coast. Investigate. Smith turned the invisible giant south. This was the Black Widow's versatility. It wasn't just a fighter, it was an attack platform. They dropped to 1,000 feet, skimming over the wave tops. The radar could detect ships as easily as aircraft. Porter adjusted the gain. The coastline of Saipan appeared as a jagged green line. Tucked inside a small cove were 3 faint returns. Japanese barges attempting to slip reinforcements ashore under cover of darkness. They believed they were safe. They believed American planes couldn't see them. Smith lined up for the attack. He selected the 4 20mm cannons in the belly once more, the sledgehammer. Hydraulic charging mechanisms slammed the massive shells into the breeches. The aircraft vibrated with restrained violence. The barges ran dark, black shapes against black water. Target 12 o'clock, 1 mile, half mile, Porter guided. You should see them now. Smith spotted the white wake of the lead barge slicing through the sea. A small, fast-moving target. He lowered the nose slightly, aiming ahead of the wake. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil was so powerful it felt as if the aircraft slowed midair. For cannons spat fire. High explosive shells walked across the water toward the barge. Then struck. The wooden hull splintered. Ammunition stored on deck detonated. A secondary explosion tore the vessel apart, hurling burning crates and men into the air. Smith pulled up sharply, banking away from the debris. He circled back. The remaining barges scattered, racing toward the beach. Too late. The Black Widow was already descending again. Smith lined up the second barge. A 2-second burst. It disintegrated. He swung toward the third. Another burst. Fuel drums ignited, transforming the vessel into a floating pyre. It was merciless. The soldiers aboard never fired a shot. They died without understanding how the Americans had found them. They died realizing the night was no longer their ally. It was their prison. But violence always carries a price. As Smith pulled away from the burning wreckage, a searchlight on shore snapped to life. It swept the sky, hunting. For a moment, the glossy black paint deflected the beam. Then the light locked on. The sky erupted with flak. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries poured shells into the illuminated cone. Black bursts blossomed around the aircraft. Shrapnel hammered the aluminum skin like hail on a tin roof. A jagged fragment punched through the cockpit floor, slicing into a bundle of wires. The instrument panel flickered. The radar screen died. "I've lost the scope," Porter shouted. "We're blind." Smith shoved the throttles forward, banking hard to escape the beam. The light followed. He dove toward the ocean, hoping to lose the glare against the dark water. Flak chased him down. A shell burst off the right wing. The aircraft lurched violently. The right engine failed. Sudden silence from that side. The dead engine dragged the wing down. The aircraft tried to roll and dive into the sea. Smith fought the controls. He slammed the left rudder pedal with all his strength, keeping the nose straight. He feathered the dead propeller, rotating the blade's edge on to reduce drag. 500 feet. One engine. No radar. Under fire. The invisible giant was wounded. "Give me a heading home," Smith shouted. "I can't," Porter yelled back. "Nav systems out. No radar. I can't see the coastline." Outside, nothing but black water and black sky. The horizon was gone. The Euro compass spun uselessly, damaged by flak. He didn't know north. He didn't know where the airfield was. And the searchlight still hunted. Smith looked upward. Stars. He found the Southern Cross. He knew the airfield lay northeast. He banked carefully, fighting asymmetric drag, and aimed the nose toward a star. He flew by feel. He listened to the healthy engine, carefully managing the throttle to keep cylinder head temperatures under control. He felt vibrations through the airframe, sensing stall speed through instinct alone. He was flying a 30,000-pound brick with one wing tied behind its back. For 20 minutes, they limped through darkness in silence. Only the steady drone of the left engine and the whistle of wind through torn metal accompanied them. Then, a faint glow on the horizon. A rotating beacon. The airfield. Smith didn't have enough power to circle. It had to be one pass. He lowered the landing gear. With the right engine dead, the hydraulic pump was useless. He grabbed the emergency hand pump and worked it frantically until he felt the heavy clunk of the wheels locking down. He lined up with the runway lights. Too fast. Without symmetrical drag from both propellers, the aircraft refused to slow. Full flaps were too risky. Asymmetric lift could flip the plane. He would have to land hot. The coral runway rushed toward them. Smith cut the throttle. The Black Widow slammed down hard. Tires shrieked. Rubber burned. The massive aircraft shuddered and groaned, devouring runway as Smith stood on the brakes with everything he had, and prayed it would stop before the darkness swallowed them again. The end of the strip was approaching fast. A sheer cliff dropping into the ocean. Smith held the brakes until he smelled burning rubber. The aircraft skidded, shuddered, slowed, and finally stopped. The nose wheel rested barely 5 feet from the edge. The remaining propeller spun down to silence. The cockpit filled with stillness. Smith slumped in his seat, drenched in sweat. His hands shook so violently he struggled to unbuckle his harness. Above him, the canopy slid open. He heard boots pounding across coral as the ground crew ran toward the aircraft. They had taken off as a joke. They had returned as a wreck. But in between, they had cleared the sky. The invisible giant had proven it could bleed. And it had proven it could kill. Major Carroll Snuffy Smith climbed out of Time's Aviation. His legs heavy and numb, as if he had run a marathon in combat boots. He descended the ladder onto the coral tarmac of Saipan. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of salt spray and aviation fuel. Tonight there was another smell. Burned metal. Shredded aluminum. The ground crew swarmed the battered Northrop P-61 Black Widow. Their flashlights traced the glossy black skin. No one cheered. They simply stared. The right wing looked as if a steel shark had taken a bite from it. A Japanese flak shell had punched a hole the size of a manhole cover through the aluminum, severing hydraulic lines and turning the interior into a twisted maze of wires and tubing. Oil from the dead engine coated the fuselage, dripping onto the runway like black blood. The feathered propeller blades stood frozen against the night sky. It was a miracle the aircraft had made it home. The single-engine fighter pilots, the ones who had mocked the flying bathtub for weeks, walked out from the operations tent. They said nothing. They ran their hands over the jagged holes. They examined the soot-streaked gun ports. They looked at the empty shell casings scattered across the cockpit floor. While they had slept, this lumbering, ugly giant had flown into the heart of the storm and absorbed punishment that would have torn apart a Mustang or a Corsair. The laughter vanished. In its place came quiet respect. The P-61 was no longer a joke. It was a shield. The next morning, intelligence reports confirmed what the radar had shown before it went dark. A Japanese Betty bomber and an Irving night fighter had failed to return. The wreckage of the supply barges washed up along the reef. But the most important result wasn't the tally. It was the silence. For the first time in months, the night over Saipan was quiet. Washing Machine Charlie did not come. Japanese commanders, realizing that darkness was no longer sanctuary, grounded their nuisance bombers. Something was waiting for them up there. Something they could not see, but that could see them perfectly. That was the true victory of the Black Widow. It wasn't just about shooting down aircraft. It was about psychological dominance. Japanese pilots were brave, often fanatically so. They would fly into walls of anti-aircraft fire without hesitation. But there is a deeper terror in facing an enemy you cannot see. Primal fear of the dark. Knowing a black predator might be stalking you, matching your speed, creeping into your blind spot, ready to unleash a sledgehammer of 20mm shells. That fear broke them. The night sky, once their playground, became a no-man's land. As the war pushed closer to Japan, the P-61 ruled the midnight hour. It operated over the Philippines, China, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. It hunted bombers and anything else that moved. Crews grew creative. They mounted rockets and bombs under the wings. They swept over enemy airfields at night, using radar to locate parked aircraft and hangars. They became intruders, raiders striking when the enemy felt safest. The invisible giant proved something else. It was tougher than almost anything in the sky. Stories spread of Black Widows flying through typhoons that grounded the rest of the Air Force. One crew endured a tropical storm so violent it stripped paint from the nose cone. Yet they completed their patrol and landed safely. Another crew rammed a Japanese fighter when their guns jammed, slicing the enemy aircraft apart with a wing and limping home with part of the enemy's tail embedded in their leading edge. It was built like a tank, fought like an assassin, and it flew like something from the future. But the legacy of the P-61 extends far beyond World War II. Smith and his fellow night witches were pioneers of a new kind of aerial warfare. Before the Black Widow, air combat was a gladiator duel, two pilots maneuvering within sight of one another. After the P-61, combat became electronic. The Black Widow proved that information was deadlier than speed. that seeing the enemy first was the ultimate advantage. This DNA lives on in every modern fighter jet. When you look at an F-22 Raptor or an F-35 Lightning II, you are seeing descendants of the Black Widow's philosophy. Radar, sensors, stealth, and the ability to strike unseen. The radar observer evolved into the weapons systems officers of aircraft like the F-4 Phantom II and the F-14 Tomcat. The glossy black finish foreshadowed modern stealth coatings. The P-61 was the bridge between the knights of the air and the digital warriors of the jet age. And yet, after the war, it met a tragic end. Specialized, expensive, difficult to maintain. When jets arrived with screaming turbines and supersonic speed, the piston-engine night fighter became obsolete almost overnight. The Air Force did not preserve most of them. They parked them in the desert. Then they brought in the bulldozers. It's a painful image. Rows of magnificent black aircraft that once ruled the Pacific night. Guillotines chopped off tails. Crushers flattened fuselages. The top-secret SCR-720 radar sets were ripped out and tossed into scrap heaps. Aluminum melted down into soda cans and screen doors. The invisible giant did not fade into the darkness. It disappeared into the smelter. Today, only 4 P-61s remain in the world. For none of them fly. They sit quietly in museums, glossy black paint dulled by dust. Visitors often mistake them for bombers because of their size. They glance at the strange fiberglass nose and twin tails without realizing what they're seeing. They don't see the terror of the night raids. They don't see the machine that restored sleep to thousands of Marines. They just see an odd, oversized airplane. But to the men who flew it, and to the men it protected, the Black Widow was never just metal. It was a presence. It was the comfort of knowing that while they lay in muddy foxholes staring into a terrifying void, something was up there with them. An angel painted black, armed with a sword of fire, watching with an unblinking electric eye. Major Smith survived the war. He returned to a world racing into the jet age. He watched contrails replace propeller arcs. He saw missiles replace machine guns. But he never forgot what it felt like to sit high in that cockpit, alone in velvet darkness, trusting a calm voice in his headset and a glowing green on a screen. He never forgot the vibration of the engines, or the faint ozone smell from the radar. He knew he had been part of something rare, a moment when a flying bathtub became the deadliest thing in the sky. The story of the P-61 reminds us that innovation often looks ridiculous at first. Experts will laugh. They will call it too heavy, too complex, too different. But in war and in life, the only thing that matters is what works. The Black Widow worked because it ignored the past and embraced the future. Proved you don't have to be the fastest or the prettiest to win. You just have to be the one who can see in the dark. So the next time you look up at the night sky, remember the invisible giant. Remember the crews who flew into ink-black storms guided by fragile vacuum tubes and courage. Remember the night hunters who turned mocking laughter into silence over a safe airfield. And remember, sometimes the monsters in the dark are the good guys.